Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be talking to you about building the right workflow for your business. A lot of you Lightroom users out there are using Photoshop, or maybe you've just always abandoned using Photoshop, trying to do as much as you can in Lightroom. Well, this tutorial is going to walk you through how to make the Lightroom to Photoshop workflow a little more streamlined. It's all about, with workflows, your end result, and more specifically, what you want to do to these images outside of Lightroom. For me, I like to do dodging and burning, run portraiture, do a little more advanced toning applications and adjustments in Photoshop rather than trying to cram that all into Lightroom. Because sometimes you don't really know what your images are going to look like, and then you export them at 300 DPI. Then you're looking at them at 1:1, pixels, and you start to notice that in Lightroom, it's a little bit different than it looks in Photoshop, especially after you already assign a color space, what you're looking at in Lightroom versus the end result. Those kind of things matter. So it's the back and forth with Photoshop. And we all use actions, right? If you're in Photoshop and you're not using actions, you're crazy. There's no reason not to create recipes or scripts to apply all these layer adjustments and things like that. We'll talk about how to build actions, how you can build an arsenal of actions to apply to your images. Take that a step further, how to go from Lightroom to Photoshop, applying actions to thousands of images, right? We're editing weddings. We want to apply maybe portraiture or something kind of subtle as a shift to all of our images as an action in Photoshop. We want to be able to do that to 1,000 images from Lightroom to Photoshop. Well, droplets are going to allow you to do that. It's a script that allows the images to open up in a Photoshop, apply an action, save it, close it, you're done, right? Now you have JPEGs that are ready to show to your client, or if you're crazy and you go through thousands of your images in Photoshop doing these little tweaks and things like that as well, you have the flexibility to do that. And so this is going to save you so much time, right? It's always about the why. Why is this important for your business? Well, you either need to be focusing on more important things rather than hand batching your images. Let Photoshop, let Lightroom do the work for you when it comes to applying simple commands, simple adjustments to your images so you can save yourself time and focus on those more important things. So let's jump into Lightroom and talk about how to get you set up in Photoshop to get started. All right, so now we're ready to start setting up our Photoshop actions to start using these and to be a little more efficient when working with our images, right? So in Photoshop, we have a fully edited image open here as well as a raw file, right? So we can show two different kind of looks, whether we're looking at an exported raw file or a JPEG that we've already edited, right? Doesn't really matter at this point. So to create an action, it's pretty simple, right? If you have your tool panel open here on the right-hand side, you can click on the Actions button, or if you don't have this panel or have your Photoshop customized, you can go up to Window and click on Actions. It's super simple. Once you have this panel open, to create an action is quite easy, right? So we have a few buttons down here at the very bottom. Most important one is going to be the create an action button here, which kind of has this little corner of the piece of paper folded up, as well as this folder to create what is called an action set. So these different folders are called sets. And these contain a multitude of actions, right? So I have my miscellaneous ones that are just kind of one specific action or adjustment that I'm applying to my image. So I have dodge and burn, I have tilt shift, black and white, vignettes, high pass sharpening, flatten and save, portraiture, image processor, all these like kind of basic level miscellaneous actions. Then I have my advanced ones, right? So I have some toning applications. I have a sort of standard starting point to do some dodging and burning. And portraiture, I have ones to do that and then adding a little bit further like white density and adjustments and things like that. So let's build an action, right? So as you see, we just have our background layer. I'm going to click on the action button and I'm going to have it saved to my miscellaneous. So if I wanted to create an action, let's create another one for portraiture, right? So in creating one for portraiture, I'm just going to name it, quite simple. Just call it portraiture standard. I'm going to put it in the miscellaneous set, which is just fine. I can assign a function key to this. So if it's one that I'm using quite often and one that I want to apply to an image quickly as I'm working in Photoshop, I might want to choose F1 and maybe just Shift. So I can do Shift Command F1. Well, this is already being used on another action. Did you see it's not letting me do the Shift and Command? So I can also assign a color to it if I want. Why not? Let's make it green. So I can click record. So now it's going to automatically throw it to the bottom of my miscellaneous set, and it's already turned on the record button. So now I need to start editing this image. So for portraiture, I'm likely going to create a duplicate of my base layer. So I'm just going to call that portraiture. I'm not going to make any adjustments here other than opacity. Likely going to put opacity at 70%. Keep everything else the same mode. I don't need to make a clipping mask, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now I go into filters, and I'm literally just walking through the steps of applying portraiture. Make any tweaks that I need to here in my left-hand panel. Kind of got it already set up from my last settings. And now I've applied portraiture to this image, as we can zoom in and see on and off. Very subtle, but it applies my portraiture adjustment to the entire image, right? So as I'm clicking around, you're going to notice that it's going to show all these different adjustments. That's something to definitely be mindful of when you're creating an action. Everything you do in Photoshop, every click that you make is going to be recorded and make your list of commands very cumbersome. So it's very important, instead of clicking up here at the top of your layers panel, I highly recommend, if you're making any specific layer adjustments, to double click on the layer, so that way you can make any of these changes if you wanted to within specifically within the layer style. Now I don't want to go to darken, of course, that's just crazy, but like for luminosity or something like that, what that's going to do is it's going to set current layer and actually make all of the adjustments inside of one line item. If you don't do that and you just start making adjustments here, it's going to make a set current layer per little tiny thing that you do, which is kind of annoying, right? So it's just kind of a little bit of an efficiency or just a best practice when making layer specific adjustments. In any case, if you want to create a layer mask and you want to turn it off, right, we hold Option, click on Add Layer Mask, so it automatically turns it off. If you wanted this to be an action that opens up, applies to your image, and then you would go in and make masking adjustments. Obviously, if we wanted this to apply and save to our image, that becomes really important, right? So working on a JPEG versus working on, from a RAW that we're opening up. From a RAW, you're going to have to save the new version every time, right? Which becomes kind of annoying. So with a JPEG, we could, in fact, apply our portraiture adjustment, right-click, flatten the image, right? Save the image. So it's automatically saving it now as our edited TIFF, and then we would hit the stop button, and that would be done. It would save it and close it, right? Our only other option, if we wanted to re-record now and go, well, I'd like to, close the image, that would be our last adjustment, right? So we can always add and re-record on our action as well, which is quite nice. So again, if we wanted to apply this, same thing to this RAW that we have opened up, automatically closes it, right? So we had it open in Lightroom already, and it was going to apply it on an image that we did the edit in feature, so it's automatically going to throw the image into Photoshop. Excuse me, save it into Lightroom. So it's not an image that I had opened up manually into Photoshop, but it automatically saved a copy and was ready to apply it in. So that's as simple as it is to make an action in Photoshop. Something else I highly recommend is when you're working with an image, we'll open this one back up, that if you want to create combo actions, it's really simple to do. Like for instance, if I wanted to create an action, I'm going to hit plus, and I wanted it to apply portraiture. Oh, let's try this again. If I wanted to right? We just did portraiture again to our image, so it's going to be pretty heavy. So if I wanted to create a new action, and right, for instance, I'm going to call it starting creative, and we'll put it into my advanced edits, hit record. I can have it apply each of these other actions at once and start to build up. Go ahead. Start to build up my my action here. So I can go ahead and do my dodge and burn, kind of reorder some things here. If I wanted it to apply high pass, start to throw around my layer adjustments, white recovery, all these adjustments here, and I'm going to go ahead and hit stop. Now I can create, very simply, this starting creative, this action will now apply all these adjustments with one click of the mouse. I don't even have to think about it, right? So these kind of things, creating combo actions, or new ones, that's what I kind of do here in my advanced. I create ones, multiple actions that are applying to create these kind of more combo, or these larger actions here to apply adjustments. So a lot of ways to save time. Let's move on to workflow A, which is the edit in Photoshop workflow to get started. Now we're ready to look at the edit in Photoshop workflow, right? So it's the first one. It's one many of us probably use. We edit directly from a single image or a small batch of images directly into Photoshop. So it's pretty simple to do, right? So I'm clicking on an image, like this one in particular, as I'm in library mode. I want to go into develop. I have my adjustments made here that I want to get started. Maybe I want to brighten this image up just a little bit. Doing pretty subtle adjustments here, nothing too crazy. I'm going to hold command and click the E key. So that's going to automatically open up my raw file. As you notice that I'm working on a CR2. It's going to open that up immediately into Photoshop. So great. I opened my image into Photoshop. Now I'm making different layer adjustments, well, image adjustments here, which I definitely recommend going to the layer adjustments, doing any kind of, anything that you want to do here, right? So you have all these different, actions, well, adjustments that we want to start working on here to work on a single image, right? So if I want to apply, a previous action from before, which I can very well do, I have my portraiture action here. Make sure it's not going to So it's going to apply a portraiture to my image. Make sure, pretty heavy amount. I think way too heavy. Probably should have used the light version. But now we kind of have a little more subtle amount of portraiture applied to my image. Now when I'm done, all I have to do is click save. Automatically saves my image. And close it. Great, we closed Photoshop. And what does that do? And that's going to automatically save a TIFF version of my file. Well, as you notice, it's automatically choosing the file type. You have to assume it's choosing the color space, the resolution, all those kind of things. So if you want to make those adjustments, it's going to automatically open up any raw file into Photoshop like that. You're not going to get settings options every time. If you have a JPEG or a TIFF or a PSD open, it's probably going to pop up on the screen and give you an option for what you want to, edit on, because it's going to have to make a copy. It's going to have to rasterize your raw file. So we can go into the preferences. Oh, excuse me, wrong button. So we can go into preferences and we do external editing. The edit in Photoshop CC 2018, so versions are going to matter. We're working in the 2018. It's going to tell me that the recommended version, recommended settings is going to be a 16-bit ProPhoto RGB, which I keep those settings the same. I also changed my resolution from 240, which was the default, to 300. I like to work with TIFFs. They're a little more universal. PSDs are going to be Adobe only, right? Because it's a Photoshop document. So it doesn't really matter, what you wanting to work on when you're doing edit in Photoshop, but I'd highly recommend TIFF or TIFF and PSD are your options there, as they're going to save layers. That's going to be kind of a single image workflow or a small batch of images. So you're a little more limited. in those options. But there are some ways to make, as you notice, I have this option down here, stack with original. There are a lot of people that probably hate stacking or find that it's, the recent changes with Lightroom Classic have made it a little more difficult, or maybe have added some bugs to stacking. But there's some interesting ways to create stacks. So what it'll do is it'll create a virtual copy of your um, of this new image that you edit in Photoshop, and it'll allow you to quickly stack it with the original. So the reason why that's important, and I'll show you real quick, is that it'll actually hide your raw behind your edited image in Photoshop, rather than like in Lightroom. When you create a virtual copy, the original is the master, the virtual copy, your edited version, falls behind the raw, which doesn't make sense, right? You don't want to have two versions of your file exported. Maybe you do, and I'm crazy, and you color label things to separate them out, but I like to kind of have them in one streamline way. So I automatically have this stacked with original. I'm going to unchoose that option so that way you can see it on a different image, what that looks like to edit in Photoshop, and apply a quick toning application here. Click continue. Oh, that's when actions aren't tested out and they didn't work correctly. So bear with me 1 second here. Sometimes it's better to test it out. Save it. It takes its time. Now we'll close that image out. And it's going to create a new version for me. So just to show you real quick the differences. So we have these two images. You notice my TIFF hopped in front of the raw file. And we have the TIFF and the raw file here, but they're not connected, right? So these are in gray, which is showing that they're stackable. So if I select all the images, right click, and I want to collapse all stacks, it automatically hides my raw file. So now I don't have that pesky raw that's just color corrected. It'll actually hide it behind. So now whenever I export, and group that back into a stack, whenever I export, it becomes really important that that raw file gets hidden, and it only exports my skin softened image here. So that's just kind of a quick workflow tip that you can make an adjustment with the preferences. If I wanted to group these into a stack, I can do the same thing. So if I want to hide my previous versions, if I have like a different edited version and I just want to have the skin smoothed version, let me zoom in here so you can see the difference. So it's applying the skin softening first. Here's my raw, and here was a creative edit that I had done before. So I can go in and just quickly collapse those, or if I've been doing that on multiple images, I can select all and collapse at the very end. Completely up to you. But yeah, just a quick workflow tip there. So if you want to turn that off, we go back into preferences, and we can uncheck or check that option every time. So it's going to either stack with the original or not. So make sure to make that adjustment before working on your images. Another big option as well, once you get, if you want to work on multiple images, you'll notice that when you're working in the develop module, it's only going to let you work one image at a time. Same way with saving metadata. So if you want to work with multiple images, here's a trick. You just go into library mode, and if you want to select a handful of images, like, for instance, we want to choose these, certain raw files. I don't want to do a whole bunch, but if I want to open all those up into Photoshop, I'm selecting them in Lightroom. I'm doing Command E just the same way, and it's going to allow me to open up these multiple images into Photoshop. Now, as it's doing this, you're probably thinking, well, I would likely use the batch processing or the automate tool, and versus opening up 10 or 15 images at a time in Photoshop. All kind of depends on your processing power of your computer. As you can see here, I'm working on a 2016 MacBook Pro, 16 gigs of RAM. Not really a great Photoshop rig to work on, so you're going to kind of see some, the performance kind of slow down a little bit as it's opening up these images. It's not very fast. But if I wanted to apply the same action to all of these images and then apply some masking, like dodging and burning, for instance, might be a perfect opportunity. I can either go image to image and use some of those function keys like Shift F1 or Shift F5 that I've assigned to with my action. As you can see here, F15, Shift +1 or Shift F1 is my function key, for this action here. Or I can choose to use automated actions to my images, right? So I have these all open. So if I go into File, Automate, and I choose Batch, the difference between choosing an option like Batch and choosing Image Processor is Image Processor is going to create a copy of our image. It's going to save this version in a different folder. Batch is going to apply it to the batch of images that I have open. So that's the biggest difference, right? These images are open and I'm working on the original. In the script, like Image Processor, it's going to create a copy to do the adjustment. So that becomes really important for like black and white, or if you want to have a separate version for skin softening versus you don't want to, you want to have a non-skin softened version. So that's a pretty big difference between how each of these different options work in Photoshop. But if I choose Batch real quick and I want to apply my, my standard starting point. Let's just do starting creative to these images. I can choose opened files or a folder of images I've already exported, but again, we're working in the edit in feature in Lightroom, so we're opened images. And I'm going to keep it on none because I want these images to stay open. If I wanted them to apply like portraiture and just close, I could do save and close and be done. But I want to work on these images a little bit further. So if I click none on them, it's going to apply this action to every one of these images open, and it's going to go image to image, apply it, and then when it's done, we can go in and make our adjustments. We have our layer masks. We can go and do some brush work. This makes sense on a small batch of images, right? Something maybe you chose 5 or 10 or maybe even 20 images maximum that you want to throw up on your blog, that you want to edit a little bit further, but you want to keep them organized in Lightroom. It's a great way to do that, right? So it's two-step, which is okay, but I've already created actions, so it saved me some time there that Lightroom's applying. This is something like, I might want to fill up my coffee cup, get a refill, and come back. So again, these are like little automated little workflow efficiency tips that you can do. I've already created my actions. So what I've done so far is I've selected the images in Lightroom. I've done Command E. I've gone into Photoshop. I've chosen Automate, Batch. I've chose the action that I want to apply, and then I made sure that I chose to apply to the open images, and then I chose it, made sure that it's when it's done, that it does nothing. It leaves the open images, and that action's applied to all of these images. So I can cycle between all of them and start doing my brush work on them right away. Right, so if I want to start doing some dodging and burning, right, I'm in my B key. Right, I'm using a mouse, so don't judge me. But if I'm wanting to go in and obviously I have to turn my action on here. You might be able to hear my fan in the background as I'm just kind of going in and applying this, brightening up the eyes. So I'm doing white recovery. There's our subtle jump in the eyes. Yeah, it's probably why nothing was getting brighter, because I was on white recovery for every one of those images. So real quick, we want to Command, delete. We'll get rid of that layer, right? So as you can see, very easy to make mistakes. But real quick, right? So we're going in and just, dodging the eyes a little bit. Nothing too crazy. Maybe I want to, burn down or do a little bit of white recovery down here in the dress. That image got really soft. I think the portraiture is a little heavy on these as well. So all these kind of adjustments and things that we can make. We just want to brighten the face up a little bit. So now what we can do is, right, we have a bunch of images open. It's going to be a pain in the butt to close them all and have them open back up. So what I like to do is the close all feature. And it's likely going to ask me to save all of these. So I'm going to do apply all. I'm going to click save, just so that way I can be done with my large batch of images. So it's going to save those documents, and then it's going to allow us to look at the TIFF version in Lightroom. So what becomes massively apparent here is, while I'm working in a wedding, I'm ready to batch out 1,000 images. This edit in Photoshop doesn't really save you any time. It's actually going to waste more of your time. It doesn't really make sense. You're not going to be doing masking on 1,000 images. You might do that on just a handful of images. So the edit in Photoshop might be a better option for you on some of those creatives or some of those images that you're wanting to throw up on your blog post to do a little more hand work and more masking work. We need something that we can export thousands of images, apply some adjustments to our images, have them close and save, and we're done. And that's going to be a separate workflow, and that's going to be exporting with droplets. So as you can see, as our images are slowly saving back into Lightroom and opening back up, we're all done. So let's move on to workflow B, which is going to be exporting with droplets. All right, so now we're ready for workflow B. That's going to be exporting out of Lightroom, having Photoshop apply our action, save and close the file, and you're done. Well, introducing droplets lets you do that, right? So we can look into Photoshop and we can start creating droplets based on the actions that we've created, all the settings that we want to apply, so that way we can export to Photoshop and save our images seamlessly, right? So in Photoshop, in the same way that we looked at the batch processes, there's an option here to create a droplet. So what we're going to do is we can choose an option where this droplet's going to save. I highly recommend, I always kind of save everything in my Adobe folder that's here. And that brings up a really good point. You definitely want to make sure you're saving actions as well as saving your droplets kind of in the same place. Actions don't automatically save. You have to actually export them out of Photoshop, which is an interesting thing. Let's do that first, right? So we're going to open up our image here. Any of our actions that we've created, right? So if I select on starting, start creative, or of course I'd want to save my action set, I can click on these three buttons here, and you definitely want to choose the Save Actions button. And I'll save those in that same location where I'll just do the documents and Adobe, and they can go here. So you definitely want to make sure to save your actions in the same way that you have to save and create droplets here in the automate feature. So just one of those quick things as you create all of your actions and you upgrade your Photoshop, or your computer crashes and you don't have any of those actions backed up, it becomes a real pain to rebuild them. So definitely want to save those out as you build those sets. Creating a droplet's really simple, right? So we're going to choose where we're going to save it, what it's going to do. So if I want it to apply, if I specifically want to create this to apply portraiture, I can, or any of my other actions, right? So I'm going to do portraiture light because I know that that's the version that I want to use. You can have it stop for errors, any of these options here. It's going to do, and it gives you an option to save and close. So if your action doesn't have save and close built into it, the droplet will do that for you. So this becomes very important when we get into Lightroom file types, right? Because if you save and close a PSD, it's going to ask you to save a new version versus if you have it save and close a JPEG, that's quite different. So you want it to flatten those layers versus you can't save a JPEG with layers. It's going to ask you to save as and create a new version, and it's going to ask you to do that on every image, right? So we want it to save and close on thousands of images. We don't want it to run into any errors, and so that's very important when you're choosing your file type there, right? So we're going to go ahead and create a portraiture light. We'll go into Adobe, choose our droplets. I already have it set up here as one, but we'll just choose number 2 so that you see that we're doing it for the first time. Portraiture light, miscellaneous, it's all done. I click OK. And that's it. So now I can go back into Lightroom. I can select all of my images, right click, go to export, and I can start to create export presets, right? So this becomes really important where we're going to go, right? So in my export folder, I typically have a batching folder right on my desktop, or maybe on an external drive if I don't have a whole lot of space. But in doing that, in that batching folder, I might create a few different subfolders just for to quickly export files into. So if I know I'm going to do skin softening for a client, I'll have it go into that folder automatically. I don't have any special subfolders. I'm not naming it the client. I just want this to be quick, quick skin softening folder for a quick skin softening batch, right? So I can go down to file naming. I'm not going to change anything. Just yet. Obviously, you could do that if you wanted to, file naming. But the really important things are we want to make sure it's exporting as a JPEG, sRGB color space, so that way it's ready to go to print. I'm not going to be doing any further editing. Obviously, if I wanted to do some masking or some further editing in Photoshop, I'd want to choose a different color space, but not for these images. It's just going to be for a batch export. I have it at 300 pixels per inch. And now we can go down to the options. Normally it's on do nothing or open in Photoshop, but to choose open in another application allows me to choose that droplet we created, right? So this is very important for us in our workflow. So something that we can do in Lightroom is we can export our image, have it run this droplet, which then runs the action into Photoshop and does it all for us automatically. So now that I've created all of these options and they're very generic, I can add a new preset, right? So I can call this skin softening right in my user presets. So the reason why that becomes important is so I can right click, export, skin softening to. So that's why I like to choose, because I know all those settings are going to stay the same. I know it's going to go to my same batching folder here. But here's where it becomes very important. Great, we did the actions, we created the droplet. Let's test it out on a handful of images rather than wait to find out that we created an error on over 1,000 images, right? So when I'm applying this, I want to make sure it's just going to run to my images properly, right? So I'm just going to choose some raw files real quick here. And I'm going to go ahead and right click, choose export, and skin softening to. So it's going to export these files. We walk away, right? Go work on something else. Come back to this later. I mean, in these type of scenarios where you're running large batches like this, it's going to do it in 2 steps. It's going to export out of Lightroom. It's going to run the droplet in Photoshop. It's going to save those files. This is something that you're not really going to want to be doing a whole lot of other operations on your computer. And I'm automatically running into an issue with what it wants to do, right? So it's going to want to save my image here, quality of 12, right? I haven't changed that option. So we'll see exactly what it's going to do as it's applying each one, and it's asking me to save each of these images. So this becomes a very cumbersome, issue with our skin softening here, right? Because I'm not going to want to sit here and click OK for 1,000 images. So that's a good thing that we tested this out on 4 of them, and making sure as it's saving these JPEGs for the first time, is this something that's going to ask me to do? So the reason why it's doing that is because I haven't created a save and close feature in my portraiture action. So it's very important to understand when you're making these different actions to apply. If it's not saving and closing them automatically, it's going to ask you to do that every time, right? So we did the save and close feature here. So what I want to do is I want to make sure we are doing this on a JPEG file originally, right? So we want to open a recent JPEG. Doesn't matter that we've done any previous editing to it, but what I want to make sure we're doing is I'm going to go back to Portraiture Light. I'm going to select on it. I'm going to hit play. So it's applied my skin smoothing. I'm going to go down here to the very bottom. I'm going to click the record button. I'm going to hit save. And I'm going to hit close. And I'm going to hit stop. So we just save and close. Now, as we added that in there, let's test this out on a different batch of raw files to see if that's what fixed our problem. All right, so anytime you're making a new droplet, you're doing any kind of adjustments, let's just do it on 3. Let's do the same thing. Make sure. Now since we saved, this is actually going to be important. Since we saved a new version of our portrait light, we want to make sure it's probably a good idea to overwrite our droplet to make sure it saves the new things. Now, probably not necessary, but I like to do that just in case. It doesn't hurt. So we just overwrote our droplet to make sure it's using the updated version of our action. So go ahead and go back to export, skin softening 2, and hopefully it's quickly going to save and close those files within the action rather than asking us or prompting us for every image to choose a quality of the JPEG and running into those. So we'll let it run. Most likely it'll pop up. Photoshop will pop up and ask us if we need to make any adjustments. It's running the droplet. Photoshop's not popping up and doing anything. So, right, that doesn't mean that it's not running. It just means that it's not prompting you or pulling up a dialog box for you to select an option in order for it to proceed. So I know that it ran those already. So I'm going to go into my export folder directly on my desktop. And there we go. It applied it on those without asking. So again, very important for you to test out the droplets on a handful of images, because if you export it out 1,000 images like that, and it's gonna ask you on every image, you might come back 2 hours, 3 hours later and realize the batch isn't done because it's been waiting on you, right? So that can be super frustrating. So I'm glad that that happened during this tutorial, so I can show you, even when, I'm very familiar with droplets, but I know Photoshop is very detail oriented. So if you don't have those checks and balances in place and you don't test it out on a handful of images, you're going to run into a massive loss of time. So those things become very important. Creating those presets in Lightroom become very important. And I like it to go to a generic folder, so that way I can right click on a batch of images and I don't even have to think about exporting. I know now that all of these images can just go to my skin softening 2 folder. I'm going to pull them obviously into my client folder and remove them later, but I don't need to be thinking about that. I just want this to be quick, right click and go. Can be super helpful in efficiency and helping you out. So there you have it. It's all in the details, right? So I always recommend batching out or exporting out a small number of images when you're working with droplets, because you never know when you're going to get that prompt to save every image, or you get an error when it's applying or trying to duplicate, as you saw when I was doing the skin smoothing, trying to duplicate an image layer and your image goes away. So those kind of things become very important, right? We want to build the right workflow, but you gotta save time. It doesn't save you time if every image needs you to still click the mouse. And if you're clicking the mouse on every image to apply skin softening, or you're using a plugin that requires you to make changes, or you can't, when you batch a large number of images, it requires you to make settings per image, that's ludicrous, right? That's not a good workflow. It should be automated. Let the programs do the work and you focus on the fine-tuned details as the creative, right? So many of us are using Lightroom. We use presets. Presets are the essence of Lightroom. So why not use actions and droplets? It's the same thing for Photoshop. It automates these tiny tasks to a multitude of images to apply the same adjustment to them. So I highly recommend you embrace efficiency, and at the very end of it, you can batch apply skin softening with portraiture in Photoshop if you hadn't been doing that before. I mean, there's plugins for portraiture, don't get me wrong, you can definitely do it in Lightroom. There's probably the same level of efficiency with plugins, but this allows you to use Photoshop and the arsenal of actions to create that same efficiency. So you're not using all these different plugins, you can just use Photoshop, you can just have it apply it in one program, and droplets are the answer, guys.